right, so we're going to cover long-term preservation and archive storage. I'll take questions at the end, of course, and then go on from there. So framing the discussion is important so you know what's coming on the slide decks. Storage growth is abundant. We all see that every day. We have witnessed that in multiple orders of CAGRs in the past few years. The data life cycles have gotten longer, and this predominantly has to do with newer applications that are coming on board. And of course, by doing that, there's more value that can be extracted out of the data. And all of this is amalgamating into expansion of the existing archive tiers, right? And we'll see what those are and why they are so. The technologies and the economics of the current technologies don't necessarily support that. There's quite a few challenges, and those challenges are limiting factors for us to continue growing into the future, especially if we have to go store exabytes and exabytes of data. We have some point of view on what the workloads that exist today on archive are being supported, and what aspects of workloads show us that maybe there's a need for something different and unique to be looked into. While there are many technologies that are being worked on, and there's lots of conference talks over here during this week by many people, we will be talking about Silica. We'll be introducing Silica to you guys, and we'll be explaining the benefits that we see in the technology and why we feel that it is the right one, or at least has the right opportunity. And then we'll see what collaborations can exist in the industry in order to bring this to fruition. Any new technology which has a grounds-up approach will need more than a village to come to fruition. So we'll need all the help from the industry. So if we try to paint the archive landscape and the problem statement, of course, you may have seen similar slides presented by many different companies, etc. A typical pyramid structure where we have premium storage, which is really high performance, but also costs a lot, being supported by flash. We follow that with our standard storage, which is called the middle tier, which has the maximum, call it, coverage on the bytes. It's medium cost structure. It's good enough for its latencies and performances and access rates. And so we use things like HDDs for that. And then there are archive storage tiers where in the industry there's a bunch of technologies that exist. Tape exists, and obviously these lines blur as they go from top to bottom. You can mix and match capacities, not capacities, but technologies for each of those segments. But that's where we are trying to introduce or bring in Silica, in the sense of that is a potential technology that addresses the bottom width of the pyramid. Of course, it's ultra cold data, but there are some unique features that can enable us to get latencies, access latencies, which are similar to maybe existing technologies. So this is from the data age study that was done by IDC. Really good study. It has been out there for a few years now. There's no doubt that the size of growth on the data is exponential, and it will continue to be so. While there will be some short-term aberrations, and that may, seem like a few setbacks, but from a long-term perspective, it is going to hold. And then if you look at the bottom left chart, it clearly has a very different y-axis on it, which says only a fraction of the data that is produced is going to be stored on some sort of a media. And of course, the media has been, HDDs, SSDs, tape, so on and so forth. And you do see some optical in there also. We would like to see if we can grow that pie, right, moving into the future. So talking about data life cycles and value creation. So there used to be, a time when you used to create, store, use the data, share it, archive it, and then end up deleting it. Predominant reasons to delete the data is obviously either the data provides no more value to you, so obviously good to delete it. But if it provides value, sometimes it's just not economical to store it any longer because of the cost structures. And that led to the deletion of the data. The market dynamics are changing. There are newer applications that are coming on board. They can extract much more value out of data, especially even if it grows old and cold. And so the new order could be where if you don't need to delete data and just archive it forever, you can use it, extract as much value as you want to, and keep doing it again and again and again. So quickly, one more question, show of hands. How many of you all would ever not want to delete your data once you have stored it? All right, good. I call it 50%. All right, so here's the value creation. This is a representation, not necessarily, I'm not plotting a particular application of sorts, but in the old life cycle where the value that was generated with the new data was high, still is high, once you had that data stored, the value quickly diminished based on the previous applications. The y-axis here is showing you different technologies. So technology A is a more expensive one than B, than C. And then the x-axis is showing you the time of deletion as to at what point of time would you have to delete data because it's not economically viable for you. So the old order, you could start with technology A, and if that's the one, you would have to delete it in short amount of time. So your area under the curve is the value that you extract out of the data set. If you have cheaper technologies on the same curve, you can obviously go longer and extract more value out of it. Newer applications start off with trying to seek more out of it. So the blue curve that you see itself is a little, towards the right. So even with technology A and even with not reusing that data any longer, you can still extract more value. So your time of deletion goes to the right. But then you see those peaks, and those peaks are every often data sets are being rehydrated so that they can be used to do things that are valuable for an enterprise, like retraining models, etc. So now with every peak, you can extract more value out of that data. And with every subsequent technology cost curve, your value increases. I'm sure there have been some previous presentations where maybe similar things may have been expressed, but that's what we are seeing in the industry now. So given all of that, can we store it all? There's a simple problem, and that's the budget problem. Typically, budgets would grow as a percentage of revenue. If an enterprise is doing good, they would obviously see revenue growth, and as association of that, you would see budget growth to go along. However, with each incremental budget dollar that you get, you want to store more data. And existing technologies do not have line of sight towards enabling these step function changes, which would allow us to store more. Here's a very simple example. The blue curve is showing an existing technology that has a certain cost curve associated with it. And if you think about a fixed budget, you could see how many, you can, on the y-axis, you can treat those bars as, exabytes or petabytes or what have you. You can incrementally store more. But if you compare that to the green curve, which is a newer technology, which starts with a lower base, has a better erosion curve just because it provides you some advantages, you can almost save 4x more data at year 10 over here as compared to what you would with the existing storage technology. So the compounding effect also goes a ways to get you to store more data. So now what we've seen is maybe a story that has been told before. There's data growth, it's abundant, cost structures are not good enough to go store everything, and hence there needs to be something new. We'll look at the workloads and the landscape for the archive segments, so as to speak. So what we are showing on the left is it's just a pictorial representation of that the market is growing, that archive market is growing. And as the growth of that market, you have seen larger segmentation of the archive itself. So previously, 10 years back, 20 years back, there was just archive, and there was archive plus BCDR. Now, fairly recently, there has been active archive, or you could think about it as something which is milliseconds of latencies, but it's still archive data. And moving out into the future, data preservation is also a segment that may come up. So we are envisioning that the archive grows into its segmentation, active archive, BCDR, data preservation, and you have different metrics that can help track the evolution of that. So latency for an active archive, you have to have milliseconds of latency, whereas for long-term preservation, the latencies can be hours, days, or even more in some cases. For the reads, the percentage of reads that we have for an active archive, it would be really high reads, but as you go to data preservation, the frequency of reads would substantially diminish. Read size, much lower for active archive, much bigger for data preservation. And of course, cost is going to be high since if we need milliseconds of latency on an archive infrastructure, the cost will need to be high as compared to something which is really long-term. So we need to go design for a technology that can possibly cover the whole gamut, the whole spectrum of this variation within the archive segment. So here's a snapshot of workloads. So the left-hand side chart is showing writes over reads ratio. In a sense, how many more writes are being done and this is a time series, so you can treat that as a day, a month, or year, or what have you, right? But in general, from a timestamp perspective, the writes are overwhelmingly higher than the reads. In some cases, they come down to about 20x. In some cases, they are all about 120x. So there's a huge variation there. However, it does signify that reads are infrequent and writes dominate the workloads in a large way. On the right-hand side chart, the left y-axis, which is the blue graphs, they're showing percent reads, meaning what amount of reads that are coming through are on the lower blob size or the lower byte size. That brings us to the right-hand side y-axis, which are the gray bars, and they signify the byte size. So we do get a lot of reads in numbers, but they're all very small in size. And they all are requiring some kind of random access by happenstance of that, and low latencies. Whereas as you go further out with larger byte sizes, the number or the frequency of hits or requests reduces, but the rehydration rate is pretty large. So we need to solve for two things. The reads can be small, and need to have low latency and random in nature. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the reads can be really, really large in size, which means we need much better throughputs, sequential throughputs. And is there a technology that can dynamically provision both of these equally efficiently? So based on everything so far, we can say that storage technology requirement from a future perspective, if we were to think about it, is we need lowest TCO, the cost of storage, meaning acquisition cost, uh, power consumption while it is storing data, while it has written data, and while it's reading data, all of it combined, and the media refreshes. How many times do you really need to refresh the media over the period of the life cycle, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? All of that goes into what's the TCO of a particular technology for this particular application, of course. Now, if you're going to store something for that long, the media has to be very resilient, i.e., it needs to be immutable. The characteristics of the media should be such that it's durable for a very long period. There's no bit rot or nothing of that sort happening. So that the resiliency of the media is an important property to think about. And then while being flexible and available. So just like we saw on the previous chart, it's dynamic. You could have small reads, many of them together. You could have large size reads, very few of them. So you need a system that can be flexed up or flexed down based on what the requirement is going to be. So these three things are the crux of what a new technology should offer if we were to go solve for this. So Silica is a potential solution that we are looking into. So it's glass media. That's what we write in. We would have a writer element to it, which is a bunch of optical components that can be housed together so that we can do sequential writing on the piece of media. Of course, substrate again is going to be glass, or the media is going to be glass. Laser sources would be the optical way to do it. From a reader perspective, again, it would be optical components like cameras, etc. The layout to read would be a 3D serpentine. Again, if you can envision a platter, you could read either sequentially or you could read that data randomly. Either of those two works. And then the library and the robotic system itself. It needs to be flexible, simple, be able to scale up and down, modular in nature so that you could change either of these elements as required. So if you need more robots, you should be able to fill in the library with more robots. If you need more racks of media platter, you should be able to do that. In eventuality, be able to make independent scaling of all of these things based on the end customer or the end service requirement. Silica data flow. So the blank media goes into the writer. It gets written. Of course, there's a throughput element to this. So the throughput will dictate how quickly or how fast we can write the media platter. It then goes into a reader because it's a warm technology. So it's write once, read many. And hence there has to be verification that the data that is being intended to write has been written as intended. Then it gets stored into the media rack, and it can be there for as long as it needs to be. Only upon request to read that media would we again fetch that platter, put it back into the reader, and then the reader does its job again. All of these things need to be done in the construct of the library and robotics mechanism to move things around from one place to the other. So what makes Silica really unique? So that's its media properties. It's the media material itself is in abundance and it's very inexpensive. That makes the media cost itself cheap, which is a departure from the existing technologies that we have, where media becomes the most expensive part. Um, the data is written inside the media. So you can envision multiple layers of media being written across the top and bottom of the glass. This is again very different from other technologies where most of the writing is done on the surface and not inside the media. That is what gives us the potential of making more dense platters. So that is ADC, or aerial density as the industry calls it. This particular aspect benefits a lot from that. The media is resilient to virtually everything and anything. Uh, Temperature fluctuations, humidity, it's electromagnetic pulse proof. Virtually anything that we can think about that happens in the data center today, this media would be immune to it. That makes the data that is written on it immutable. You cannot change it, you cannot tamper with it, cannot erase it. There is no bit rot, there's no data corruption. None of those things need to be dealt with as we do today. And then the media consumes no power. Once you have written the data inside the media and once it's stored on a shelf, it's there without any power. So that makes it really green. It also has a good recyclable element to it, where silica is glass. You can just recycle it to make a new glass platter if that need ever arises. So let's talk about disaggregation. So today's technologies all have they're all integrated together. Hard disk drives have the reader, writer, media, electronics, all of it together in a box, and that's how it gets sold. So there's very little that can be done in terms of having to disaggregate it. It's not possible. From a tape perspective, we have the drive, and then we have the media itself, the cartridge itself. That is one level of disaggregation that happens in the tape world today, and that can be viewed as one of the advantages of you can scale things differently, but it still goes into one monolithic robotics that houses all of those things together. For silica, we can virtually disaggregate everything and anything. So we have our readers, we would have writers, the media, the robotics. All of those can be scaled independently of each other. And that's important, again, going back to the previous chart that we saw on the workloads. If you have a requirement for very low frequency, or rather I should say high frequency, low reads, low bite size reads, you would want the mechanical overheads to be minimized. And if you want the mechanical overheads to be minimized, you would want to support that with more robots or shuttles in this case, with libraries that are closely spaced to the reader elements. As against if the data is really long-term preservation data, which only needs to be accessed once in many years, and you know that, then the mechanical aspects don't really matter as much. And so the data, the media itself can be stored way far away from where the reader elements are. Similarly, on the writer side, depending on the data ingest, if you have 1 exabytes of data coming in, or you have 1 petabytes of data coming in, you only need to deploy the scale that you require, that is governed by your ingest rate, which then is governed by a throughput rate. So that gives us a lot of flexibility to be able to scale readers, writers independently of each other. Now, the physics works. We've obviously shown this. There's videos that are out there that are proof that we have written data on a platter. We have read it back. Obviously, there are engineering problems that need to be solved. Developing a grounds up technology is not easy. We understand that, both in terms of hardware and software. There are new decoding and encoding pipelines that will need to be developed, which may be different from what we have today. And then dynamically scaling all of these independent subsystems on the fly is again a challenge, but of course a challenge that can be solved with engineering solutions to it. So opportunities for industry collaboration. So there's hardware design. The writer, the reader are two big elements of this construct. There's obviously a lot of mechanical parts that would be, and optical parts that would be part of this hardware design. We would look forward to industry collaboration on these aspects to work jointly to bring cheaper, more efficient solutions at scale to the market. The library mechanics themselves, today we can tune it for a particular form factor, media size, but if we can think about library mechanics that can be applied to any media out there, just not silica, but something that can be used for other platters or other media types, then that becomes a common solution that can hunt for multiple technologies, just not for silica. New supplier base. We are going to be needing lasers, cameras, optics, mechanical components. All of these things will need a newer supply base. Again, something that exists in parts across the industry, but there's need for more. Safety enclosures. You can see those shuttles out there. You really don't want to get close to that if that shuttle is moving at a really high speed. So within the data center, how do we go solve for safety enclosures such that there's no human interaction or contact with that shuttle? Media cleaning. This is going to be an important aspect when we store the media for long-term preservation, and if it's not required to be accessed at all for many years. You can envision that glass platter is going to collect dust, and that may play with the fidelity of how it reads. So there will need to be some sort of a cleaning mechanism that helps us ensure that it either remains clean throughout its lifetime by means of scheduled mechanical cleaning, or it gets cleaned right before it enters the reader. So something that is going to be new and different for silica. And then data center footprint. We know existing technologies reside both in the cloud as well as on-prem. And sorry, did I lose it? Okay. And this would be no different from that particular aspect, meaning there could be installations that would be required by customers that ask us to have this on-prem. So we have to design and solve the reading aspect of it as well as the storage aspect of it in the cloud as well as in an on-prem data center. Okay, and that's what it. Questions? Yes, please.
I guess one question is how often, presumably as the technology progresses, you'll be able to build silicon-based storage that is denser. So the question is, how long can you go before you have to migrate to a new version, a much denser version? reason I ask this is in the tape world, we come up with a new generation every 3 years where we would double the density and double the throughput, but we would often have to change the magnetic recording technique. What that would mean is that for any, say, two generations back, you might, as historians could go across to read that media with this one. So from the day you write this tape, in 15 years, nobody can economically produce a drive that can read it. So what are can you extend the time between, having to migrate to new media?
Yes, good question. So I'll repeat the question just because I was asked to do so. So your question was, if I can rephrase that exactly, you're asking, as current tape libraries or tape media has couple generations of backward compatibility, but once you have written it, then third generation and fourth generation cannot be read back with the same equipment. So what happens in this case? How are we, what is this any different from what we are doing today on other technologies? Fair? Okay. So that is an excellent question, and that has been top of the mind as we are designing this. So in terms of generation, we have a roadmap that obviously has certain media density improvements and throughput improvements associated with it. So really there are three things, right? How can you improve the writer throughput? How can you improve the reader throughput? And then how can you improve the media density itself? Since all these three are disaggregated, like we just talked about, we have a better resolution towards making the silica platter that we write in the first generation to be read by either third or fourth generation, because we would have that disaggregation solve for it to some extent. We will still have to go solve for the readers and writers of the next generation to make sure that they're backward compatible. But that is an absolutely great question, and that has been top of the mind for us. Go ahead.
Okay, another one is, you mentioned a bit should not be any bit wrong. Presumably, as the technology progresses and the volume needed to store a single bit becomes smaller and smaller, at some point it will be subject to, say, disruption by a cosmic ray. Or how would you address that? Just simply minimize the minimum volume? Or
so
I don't understand, what is the physical mechanism here using stored data?
Yeah, so the idea here is, since we are writing in layers inside the glass media, you're encapsulating the storage within that, and as a result of that, you really don't expose the media to any of the elements that would induce a bit rot. The question you're asking is, as we go lesser in density, or rather we increase density and the spot size becomes smaller and smaller, does that introduce some sort of an element? It's a good question. I'm sure there will be some aspects of it. I currently don't have a response for that, but that is something we will certainly try to address, and we will probably go into many more details in October here with the SOSP paper coming out on this topic. So maybe we'll be able to address that in that paper. Go ahead.
So related to this, there's also the problem of how you encode your data and how you store that SDC and the data structure. We look at the 60s, everybody was doing COBOL. If I ask anyone to write a line of COBOL today, COBOL will have troubles finding someone capable. So how is that going to be also something standardized together with the hardware? How do you guarantee that in 30, 40 years we can still have the capability, software capability?
Yes. No, that's excellent. Again, excellent question. So our intent is obviously going to be not to have to do media refreshes, right? Like we do on existing technologies today. That's the intent, and we are trying to hold true to that intent. But whether that becomes a refresh in 30, 40 years, so like today, if you're doing a refresh in 5 years, that would end up translating into maybe a 20 or 30-year refresh, right? So you would expand the scale of that, and as a result of that, you would reduce the cost of the storing of the technology. But You're right, 30, 40 years from now, how do we design the encoding and decoding that it sustains itself? Again, it will have a much longer term than the existing technologies. Whether we can absolutely guarantee it for 100 years or not, that needs to be worked out. You had a question?
You mentioned that it is EMP protected early in the presentation. What about temperature, humidity, and field pressure in general?
So temperature, the studies that we have done so far, it is not susceptible to temperature ranges within the scope of the data center, of course. From a humidity perspective, there's no issues that we have found so far. Again, within the construct of the data center, right? So this won't be lying out somewhere in the open. It will certainly be in some sort of a data center, but the restrictions that we have today on the existing technologies are so stringent that this technology would not have the same thing. Go ahead.
Sorry, are you writing, so you're saying you're writing in various layers or slices of the glass. Is that a physical layer in the glass, or that's just the depth of the optics?
So it's within the physical.
Can you repeat? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. Your question was, we are writing inside in the depths or multiple layers of the glass. So how exactly are we doing it? So again, through optics, we are trying to change the numerical aperture of the optics so that every voxel that we create in the glass is a 5D structure, I would say, and hence, in order to make sense of the whole encoded data, you would need to take images on the top, bottom of all those layers, and then the decoding will take into account the error corrections within those layers to come up with the fidelity of the reader.
So the glass is uniform throughout?
Yes.
Okay, and then one more question on that. In the time frames that I'm thinking of for permanent archive, glass moves. It's not a solid, it slumps. You can see that on any old house that you've been in or stained glass.
Yes. Yes.
Does error correction account for that?
So yes, so it will account for some of it, and then the structure of the glass itself is that is something that is glass comes in various forms, right? So there's some doping that can happen in the glass to make it more resilient. So I'm not at the liberty of saying what exactly that would be for us, but we are looking into that as a mitigation for that. Go ahead.
What kind of densities do you have on this now?
So the question was, what kind of densities do we have this for now? So I cannot state the density today just because I'm not at the liberty to do that in this conference. But we should be able to provide more information on this in October.
Are you significantly below the wavelength?
What is that?
Are you significantly below the wavelength?
Significantly below the wavelength? No. Okay. All right.